Okay, I will, I think it's this one. And let's do slideshow if it will let me. Oh, here we go. Can you all see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm glad we've got sound. This is fantastic because I always like to start a presentation with a bit of a quiz. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. This is going to go fast. All I need you to tell me is whether you believe the statement is true or false. Here we go. Dementia is the 5th leading cause of death in Australia. True or false?
True.
Actually, it's false.
Oh, no.
Believe it or not, it's the 2nd leading cause of death in Australia.
Wow.
Yep.
And the primary cause of morbidity, and this is only going to get worse in the future. It's going to be the big disease of the future in the world.
Wow.
Next question. Adherence to a Mediterranean diet is associated with reduced risk of premature death. True or false?
Yes, true.
You're correct. Many studies have found this association across many populations, particularly non-Mediterranean populations, believe it or not, particularly from diseases such as heart disease and diabetes and cancer. The third question, light olive oil contains less fat than regular olive oil. True or false?
It might be a trick one. I'd say false.
Anyone else brave enough to chirp up?
Yeah, I'll guess false.
False. Yeah, false, true. False.
I also think false.
Isn't it just light in flavour?
Yeah.
You're absolutely correct. It is false. It is light in flavour, light in colour, because they have chemically extracted the last remaining bits of oil from the pip, which means it is devoid, it is deficient in polyphenols, which we now believe are one of the most important things about olive oil. So it's akin to white bread in the olive oil category. Do not buy light olive oil. You might as well buy cheap vegetable oil. Number 4, fish and wine were consumed daily in the traditional Mediterranean diet.
False.
False.
Why? You
Was
seem
it
very
more occasion?
I'm going to guess true. Oh,
It is false. And this is because fish consumption and seafood consumption were very much related to proximity to the sea. So if you lived inland, you actually didn't get fish very often, and most of your protein came from plants. The other thing is there are several countries that surround the Mediterranean basin that have a lot of Muslims, and of course there'd be no alcohol consumed whatsoever. But even in countries like Greece, in the traditional Mediterranean diet, women often didn't drink at all in any case. So there's this great misconception that a Mediterranean diet involves a lot of red wine.
That's good.
Number 5, grilling is a healthy way to cook meat.
False. False.
Why?
There's AGEs.
Ages, heterocyclic amines,
Yeah.
polyaromatic, you're absolutely correct. And so many people believe, but it's lean. It's a lean piece of steak, or it's a lean fillet of chicken. It's not just about what you cook, it's how you cook it that appears to be important for good health. And finally, we should learn to get more medicine from the farm, not the pharmacy.
False. I mean,
False.
True. Darren.
I just
Okay, lovely. So this is tonight's talk outline. Briefly, I'm going to introduce you to this concept of the Mediterranean diet. We'll cover some health effects. There are so many we could talk about. I'm going to introduce you to the key foods that characterize the dietary pattern, tell you a little bit about the cuisine and lifestyle elements, and most importantly for you personally, I'd like to share 7 tips to help you adopt more of a Mediterranean diet and lifestyle.
That's good.
Finally, we will end up looking at who is recommending the Mediterranean diet for use today in clinical practice, in public health, and so on. We'll conclude, and then we will take questions. How does that sound?
Beautiful.
Okay, so what is the Mediterranean diet? Well, firstly, I should start off by saying there is no one Mediterranean diet. There are multiple Mediterranean diets because there are more than 20 countries that surround the Mediterranean basin. just last month, as it happens, we published a narrative review defining the different Mediterranean diets from ancient times to modern times. The archetypal Mediterranean diet discussed in the scientific literature is what we call the traditional Mediterranean diet. And this was the dietary pattern that was found in the olive growing areas of the Mediterranean basin in the 1950s and 1960s. And as typified basically on the island of Crete in Greece and in southern Italy. Now, when you think about that time period, this was a time period when they'd come out, you know, from the Second World War. So, you know, they were fairly poor. Diets were pretty frugal, and they were mostly plant-based. It was mostly what they could grow. And at that stage, of course, there was no fast food culture, and, you know, food globalization hadn't yet hit. So we're talking about a time period where people mostly cooked what they could grow or what they could, if it involved animals, what they could rear. And the whole traditional Mediterranean diet, the reason people started talking about the Mediterranean diet was because of the work of Ansel Keys. Some of you may know of Ansel Keys, very, very famous researcher because of the 7-country study, which initially looked at 19 populations of men across 7 countries, and surprisingly found that the men on the island of Crete had 14 times lower incidence of coronary heart disease compared to, say, men in Finland. What was interesting at the time also was that the Cretan men didn't have the lowest cholesterol levels. The Japanese men did, but the Cretan men had the lowest death rates. And today, of course, we know that it's not just your total cholesterol level that determines risk, but the form of that cholesterol. So, for example, if it's oxidized, it's more likely to stick, to adhere to your blood vessel walls. And when you eat a plant-based diet that's full of antioxidants, your cholesterol might be moderate, but it still could be much more protective than somebody who doesn't eat a plant-based diet and who tends to have a slightly lower cholesterol. So you may have seen pyramids like this. There are several of the Mediterranean diet. This is probably my favorite if I had to pick one. This comes from the US, from the Old Ways Foundation, and they are a not-for-profit group, and they're trying to protect the old ways, protect various traditional dietary patterns. The reason I like this is because it's quite colourful and very, very simple, and also because on the bottom, as you can see, it's not just the food and the diet, it's the whole lifestyle and the cuisine. It involves physical activity, involves the social connectedness, all of those things. But the key message I'd like you to get from this pyramid is that this is a plant-based dietary pattern. And quite possibly the original plant-based dietary pattern comes from ancient times. Animal products were consumed, but at much lower levels. And of course, the main drink was water. This is something that often gets missed. Now, just to give you an idea of how widely studied it is, I thought I'd have a quick look in Google Scholar just to see how many times it's been cited in various publications. So these are not necessarily original studies. It could be mentioned in a review or an editorial. But have a look at this. If you type in Mediterranean diet, you get over 700,000 hits in Google Scholar. Compared to a vegetarian diet, that's roughly 10 times more hits. And interestingly, the other dietary patterns I've looked at here are also plant-based, except for the Atkins diet and the paleo diet. And you would think there'd be far more literature on the paleo diet based on what you hear and read in the blogosphere. But actually only about 24,000 hits were made in any article mentioning the paleo diet. So I believe it probably is the most researched dietary pattern we have to this point in time. The other thing that many people don't know, it's actually the only dietary pattern in the world that's protected by UNESCO. Did you ever think UNESCO would protect a diet? But they're protecting it. They describe it as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity, because again, it's a whole lifestyle approach, and at the moment there is fear that it is disappearing, as even all the Mediterranean countries are adopting westernized dietary patterns and lifestyles. And even the Vatican is interested in the Mediterranean diet. Everyone seems to be interested in it. I found this earlier this year that the Vatican, in their Pontifical Academy of Sciences, ran a special workshop on the Mediterranean diet, and I had a look at who spoke, and they really got a good lineup of some of the key researchers in this area from around the world. So what's some of the key health effects that have been studied? Let's have a look. There are many conditions that are being studied with respect to either prevention or better management, possibly even reversal. Tonight I'm going to focus on cardiovascular disease because that is currently the #1 killer in Australia. Secondly, I will talk a bit about cognition and dementia because that is the #2 killer, and it's also the area that I'm working in. So probably because of the vast literature, and the easiest way to try and summarise some of these findings is to share with you one systematic review and meta-analysis. Now, I don't know how much in your course you've looked at various study designs, but a systematic review systematically searches out all the research evidence in the whole wide world ever done on a particular topic. It should be prospectively designed and tries to then collate all that evidence and very systematically come to conclusions about, on the whole, what all the studies are saying. Is there reduced risk, increased risk, and so on? Now, this particular systematic review, the reason I've selected this, and there are so many, in fact, even in the area of cognition, there are more than 17 systematic reviews at this point in time, even though that's a fairly new area. But I've chosen SOFI's systematic review because this is their 3rd one, and they tend to update their systematic review. So this one was published in 2013, and it's an update on the 2008 systematic review that they conducted. This particular systematic review just looked at prospective studies, so these are epidemiological population-based studies, and looked at various outcomes to do with health and Mediterranean diet adherence. In their latest review, they included 35 studies, and this represented more than 4 million people. So this is a lot of data to look at. They also developed an 18-point scoring system. They looked at 9 elements in the diet, but the range of scores were from 0 to 18, 18 being the best score. And overall, they found the following. Oops, jumping ahead of myself. Increasing your Mediterranean adherence score simply by 2 points, and remember the scale is from 0 to 18, simply by 2 points was associated with an 8% risk of premature death. Actually, if you looked at the lowest to the highest score, the risk of death was reduced by 32%. But this is only getting people shifting a bit towards more of a plant-based Mediterranean diet, and they could already detect reduction in death risk. 10% reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease, 4% reduction of various cancers. And in this particular review, there were no new papers published on Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So I've just included the risk reduction from the previous paper, which was around 13%. So most studies on most populations are showing that people tend to live longer and have lower rates of these common chronic diseases that we're seeing in Western countries. Now, the next study I'd actually like to tell you about is a randomized controlled trial. So this is a clinical trial, and this is a very important clinical trial. It's called PREDIMED. Has anyone heard of this particular study? Some people are nodding their heads, but I can't see all of you, so I'm going to have to go with possibly half of you. Yes. Why is this important? Because in terms of nutrition research, it's rare to find such a big study that's been intervening for such a long time. So this was a multi-centre study. It involved 11 centres in Spain, and they were looking at the primary prevention of cardiovascular disease. So that means they wanted to see if it prevented having the first heart attack or the first stroke a person might get. Prior to this study, some years ago, there was a study from France called the Lyon Diet Heart Study, and that study had shown that more of a Mediterranean-style dietary pattern could reduce the risk of having a second heart attack or a second stroke by up to 70%. So they were keen to look at, well, does it actually prevent a first one, or does it reduce the risk? So they designed this study. Now, as I mentioned, it's a big study, over nearly 7,500 people. Just over half were female. Interestingly, the average BMI was 30, so these were not slim people. BMI, as you know, of 30 is just entering the obesity range. Average age was 67, and interestingly, they selected specifically people who had at least 3 risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So to be eligible to get into the study, you either had to have type 2 diabetes, you had to be a smoker, or high blood pressure, or high lipids, or overweight, or just have a family history of early onset cardiovascular disease. So these people didn't have a heart attack yet or a stroke, but they had very strong risk factors. And what they did is they randomized them to one of 3 diets. First diet was a Mediterranean diet, but in addition, they gave them free, and EVOO stands for extra virgin olive oil. Free olive oil. They actually gave them 1 litre a week, so there's enough for them and for the whole family to try and encourage adequate consumption. They wanted them to have at least 50 mils a day. The second group was also a Mediterranean diet, but in this case, they gave them free of charge nuts, because they wanted to increase compliance with the intake of nuts. And the third group, they tried to get people to adopt a low-fat diet based on the American Heart Association guidelines. Now, this group also got some gifts, but they were non-food gifts. The primary endpoint they were looking at was incident cardiovascular disease. They developed like a composite score, which included heart attacks, stroke, and death from all cardiovascular causes. So that's what they were interested in seeing. Would putting people on a Mediterranean diet with olive oil or a Mediterranean diet with extra nuts compared to a low-fat diet reduce the risk of primary cardiovascular disease? They also, as you could imagine, being such a massive study with so much potential to collect data, were collecting data on all kinds of secondary outcomes that you can see there. Now, for those of you who like to dig up studies and look at the data, this particular study, because it's such a big study, has its own website, and I've listed that for you there below. And as of this week, there are 238 Predimed publications, which is huge for any single study. So let me tell you the results. They found, and the average follow-up was about 4.8 years. Now, being a randomized controlled trial, people are recruited at different stages. So some people were followed up for 6.5 years, but actually the median was 4.8 years. Overall, they found that on either of the 2 Mediterranean diets, whether you got the olive oil or the nuts, there was a 30% reduced risk of having primary coronary event like a heart attack or a stroke. And this was in comparison to the lower fat diet. Now, I just might comment on this lower fat diet. It was meant to be a low fat diet, but they struggled to get people to reduce their fat enough. So actually, on this low fat diet, the fat intake was still around 37%. But on the 2 Mediterranean diets, the fat intake was like 42%, and it was predominantly coming from the nuts or the extra virgin olive oil. The other interesting thing, you might be thinking, well, hang on, it's a Spanish population. Why would you give them extra virgin olive oil? Because they wanted to ensure they were using an olive oil with a high polyphenol content that they had measured. Not all olive oils have a high polyphenol content. So they wanted to give them the best type of olive oil. The other interesting thing to me about this study was these people, if you recall, had 3 or more risk factors. Many were already on medication. So this is the effect achieved over and above the medication they were on. So they're saying this is really like the residual effect that lifestyle, in this case diet, may be able to achieve even when you give standard cardiac care. Now, in addition to reducing primary cardiovascular disease by around 30%, they have been collecting data on all these secondary outcomes. For example, type 2 diabetes was reduced by about 40%. Peripheral artery disease, cognitive decline, I'll look at that in a minute. Plaque progression, I measured that, was reduced. Even weight gain, you would expect someone on a diet with 42% calories from fat would gain weight. They did not find that. Breast cancer reduction, even retinopathy in diabetics was reduced. And a whole bunch of other risk factors were improved, from blood pressure to insulin sensitivity, various inflammatory markers, and even the metabolic syndrome, where they found that on the 2 Mediterranean diets, after that period of roughly 5 years, people had a much higher rate of reversion compared to people on a low-fat diet. So this study is now completed, the PREDIMED study, but they're still publishing papers because there are so many outcomes that they have measured. And it's going to be one of these studies that's going to be very highly cited for many more years to come. Now, I thought I'd throw in just one study or one paper to briefly talk about endothelial function. Because some people have, particularly 15 to 20 years ago, some people were concerned that if you included olive oil in your diet or any fat, that this could injure your endothelium. But what does the data say? Well, if you look at those early studies, and there's really only a handful of them, mostly by Vogel et al., they either gave just an olive oil, which they did not define. We don't know if it had polyphenols, whether it was a refined olive oil. They compared it to other plant oils like a vegetable oil. And when you do that and you just feed that to rats or even to humans, it seems to impair the endothelial lining, endothelial function. Now, endothelial function is really important because it's the first step towards atherosclerosis. You don't want anything that's going to injure your endothelium. Since then, quite a few studies have been published actually in humans looking at the whole dietary pattern. They all seem to show the same thing. Even if you do have a high-fat diet, as long as it's using the extra virgin olive oil, you actually improve endothelial function. You don't, cause it to worsen. Now, this is one of the earliest studies that looked at the Mediterranean diet, compared it to a prudent diet, which was a low-fat, high-carb diet, specifically in people with a metabolic syndrome. And this is why I'm showing it to you, because this is not part of PREDIMED. This was published in 2004 in JAMA. But at 2 years, the people on the Mediterranean diet, which was the high-fat diet, achieved greater weight loss, and these are statistically significant results, the ones I'm showing you, and experienced a greater reduction in inflammatory markers. Now, again, something like CRP is well known.
CRP.
Yes, so CRP, C-reactive protein, is a generalized marker of inflammation in the body. It's actually something your GP can measure, though they can't measure IL-6 and other inflammatory markers. But on the Mediterranean diet, this marker of inflammation, which we know is related to endothelial function, was actually improved. It was reduced. They also developed an endothelial function score where they looked at several components, and this also improved in the Mediterranean group, but it remains stable in the low-fat, high-carb group. And interestingly, in terms of metabolic syndrome, often called syndrome X, and this is where you have at least 3 risk factors for diabetes or cardiovascular disease. For example, you might have abdominal obesity, You might have high blood pressure. You might have high triglycerides. On the Mediterranean diet, 40 out of the 90 actually still had metabolic syndrome. In other words, 50 had reversed their metabolic syndrome, whereas the level that had reversed it in the low-fat, high-carb group was much lower. As I mentioned, there are many other studies, including, for example, a study on young women with what we call pre-hypertension. So that's the level where your blood pressure is increased, but you're not yet put on medication. So your systolic might be running at 100, up to 139 millimeters of mercury, and your diastolic up to 90. But in healthy young women with this type of pre-hypertension, where they compared adding to their diet a high polyphenol olive oil and a refined olive oil without the polyphenols, they found that the high polyphenol olive oil lowered their blood pressure to the same effect that a drug medication would do. So what the thought now is, in terms of the researchers in this field, is, and this is based on good evidence, it appears that the polyphenols in olive oils, such as hydroxytyrosol or tyrosol, actually increase the formation of nitric oxide in blood vessels. And nitric oxide is a potent vasodilator. And this is really, really important. We know people who use more of it have lower blood pressure, which must mean their endothelium is working better. But there is now indication that this could be the mechanism. Plus, of course, in the whole Mediterranean diet, you're eating far more polyphenols, not just from the original olive oil, but from other plant foods. So let's move on to cognition. And I just wanted to show you quickly a couple of results from a few studies. This is from the Memory and Aging Project. This is a US study. And in this study, they're following around 800 Americans. These are not spring chickens. As you can see, the average age is 81.5, but these are older people that are cognitively normal. And across, at least, well, in some people it's been over 10 years, but a mean follow-up of over 4 years, they have subjected them to multiple cognitive tests, 19 in fact, and they've done this at least on 2 occasions. And they've also tried to assess how much they're sticking to more of a Mediterranean style diet and how much they're sticking to more of what's called a DASH diet. I don't know if you've covered the DASH diet before. Anyone heard of that? It stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. And this is a diet that's been developed by the US government many years ago now, specifically to target hypertension, and it's very effective. And of course, at the core of this diet, again, are plant foods. It's a plant-based dietary pattern. Now, if you look here, this is the global cognitive score. So this is the overall score of their cognitive function. With time, on both the DASH, you look at the DASH score and the Mediterranean score, everyone's cognition declines, okay? As we get older, our cognitive function declines. That's to be expected. But if you look at the adherence to the Mediterranean diet or to the DASH diet according to tertiles, in other words, people in the third tertile adhere most and people in the first tertile adhere the least, you see something really interesting. So with the highest adherence to the Mediterranean diet, this decline, let's start with the DASH diet, this decline is less steep than if you don't adhere to the diet. So whether you look at DASH, whether you look at Mediterranean, these are both plant-based dietary patterns. It appears that the dietary patterns are slowing the decline in cognitive function that occurs with aging. Another study, this is from the YCAP study in the US, also by Skamia, who's a leading researcher in this field of cognition. Again, in this case, that's average age of 77. But in this case, some of them had normal cognition, some were already diagnosed with MCI, which is the mild cognitive impairment stage. If you don't know a lot about MCI, all you need to know is MCI to dementia is like pre-diabetes is to diabetes, okay? we can now assess people and diagnose them with MCI. And the scary thing is that if you're diagnosed with MCI, the data suggests that more than half of the people with MCI will convert to full-blown dementia in about 5 years. In other words, if you've got MCI, you want to get in and do everything you can to slow that progression. So in this case, some had MCI, some had normal cognition. On average, followed up for 4.5 years, lots of neuropsych testing, etc. And I just want you to notice these two graphs. The first one shows the cumulative probability of remaining MCI-free with time. So again, as you go across with increase in time, with increased years, everyone's risk of having MCI increases. So the probability of remaining MCI-free decreases. But this top line here, it represents people with the highest adherence to the Mediterranean diet. This one is medium adherence. This is with the lowest adherence. So again, it appears that the Mediterranean dietary pattern may be attenuating this decline in cognition and helping you to remain MCI-free. But basically, they found about a 28% reduced risk of having MCI if you were in the highest tertile of adherence to the med diet. And if you already had MCI at the start of the study at baseline, they showed that there was about a 48% risk of you converting from MCI to full-blown Alzheimer's disease if you were in the highest or the medium or the middle tertile for adherence to the Mediterranean diet. So not just from this study, but from several other observational studies, we know now, at least observationally, there's a lower risk of developing MCI, developing Alzheimer's, developing dementia in general, conversion of MCI to dementia. And even if you have dementia, there's a lower death rate the more you adhere to a Mediterranean dietary pattern. So something's definitely going on. And we're now obviously looking at clinical trials. Now, one of the clinical trials, and we've just submitted a systematic review on all the RCTs, looking at Mediterranean diet adherence and cognition, and or brain morphology and function. But this is the best one, and this comes from Predimed, the study I mentioned earlier with regards to cardiovascular disease. I'm just going to show you this one graph. They ran 19 tests on these people, and as mentioned, the Predimed, the whole cohort is more than 7,000 people. But when they planned Predimed, nobody was doing research on the brain at that point in time, so they didn't have baseline measures of cognition for the whole cohort. But a sub-cohort from Barcelona, which was recruited later, they were able to get in and assess their baseline cognition. So in these 447 Spanish people, average age of about 67, they were able to measure their cognition at baseline and also do a post measurement. So this is why this is a really important study. And of the different 19 tests of their cognitive function, they group them into 3 domains. So in neuropsychology, they talk about all these domains. Basically, it's like areas of brain function. So you'll see the first domain is memory. Second one is frontal cognition. So that's what we call executive function, where you do all the hard stuff, reasoning, taking things on board, judging. And the last one is the domain which is called global. So that's kind of your overall cognitive function. What you'll notice here, the score on cognition, and if you look at these bars, which are color-coded, see this dark blue bar? This is the control group. This is the low-fat group, or the low-fat group. So for all 3 domains of cognitive function, the low-fat group got worse, okay, over this period of time, an average of 4.1 years. But the Mediterranean diet groups appear to get a little better. But where the money is really the difference between the different med groups and the control groups. And the statistically significant results were, for the Mediterranean diet group supplemented with 30 grams of nuts per day, there was a significant difference in the memory domain. For the Mediterranean diet group supplemented with olive oil, they seem to do better with frontal cognition and global cognition. So while certainly we need to have a lot more clinical studies conducted in this area, it appears that the Mediterranean diet, whether it's with nuts or with olive oil, or may I suggest with both, which is traditionally how it was consumed, may be slowing this decline over time and see with age. I'm starting to get some feedback now. I'm not sure why. Okay, that's good. I'll stop now. Just a very quick one. Although people have been looking at cognition for a little while now, the other area that's really starting to grow is looking at the brain structure and the brain function. And I'm just going to show you this one slide from, again, a US study, the YCAP study of people without dementia, healthy people, but they were older, average age of 80. And again, they looked at how much they complied with, adhered to a Mediterranean diet score, and then looked at their brain volume. Because we know as people get older, their brain starts to shrink. The volume is reduced, both the grey matter and the white matter. In this particular study, you can see here, high adherence to the diet is this light blue. Okay, so with high adherence to the Mediterranean diet, the mean cortical thickness was the highest. Fish also seem to be fairly protective, but with low adherence to the diet, the cortical thickness is reduced, so you're getting more brain shrinkage. With meat, of course, it's the opposite, as has been borne out by many studies. The more meat you eat, the more your brain, it would appear, shrinks. And in this particular study, they estimated this protective effect that the Mediterranean diet might offer is similar in terms to 5 years of aging. So it appears to be protecting the shrinking of the brain that might occur otherwise. Okay, so moving right along, time is flying. What are some of these key Mediterranean foods? Well, I thought I'd group them in terms of 10 elements, and I'm using the concept of the traffic lights here, so it's very visual for you, okay? Green means go, or they had a high intake of these foods. Orange or amber means moderate, they ate these moderately, and red, of course, means stop. They also had a very low intake of these foods. So just quickly running through them. Extra virgin olive oil, and let me say all the olive oil in the traditional Mediterranean diet was extra virgin. It would have contained polyphenols, but not all the olive oil you buy in the supermarket shelf is extra virgin, and even if it is, it may have a low polyphenol content, and we can discuss that question time if that's of interest to you. Vegetables, very high vegetable intake. You can see on average, almost half a kilo. So this is not having a little bit of a vegetable on the side or as a condiment. This is making your meals based on vegetables. Legumes, grains, and in those days particularly they were whole grains. For example, they used barley a lot and they used whole wheat. And even when they made these into flour, the particle size of the flour was quite coarse. And we know from more modern research studies that a more coarse particle size results in a lower glycemic index compared to a very fine powdery flour, which raises blood glucose and insulin very rapidly. Animal products such as dairy, fish even, were consumed only moderately. Interesting thing with dairy is adults did not drink milk. Milk was reserved for children or for the elderly. And there might be something in this, and we can discuss this again in question time. But the kind of dairy they did have, firstly, was from sheep and goats, which to me is another interesting thing because sheep and goats have A2 protein, like breast milk, whereas the modern cow milk has A1 or a combination. And A2 protein may have very different health effects compared to A1, which is what some of the studies are suggesting. So that mostly have these soft white cheeses or yogurt. These are fermented foods made from sheep and goats, not cow. Fish, again, depends where you lived. And even to this day in Greece, they tend to eat the smaller fish, not these big fish, which we now know also have much more mercury and lead and other toxic substances. Wine wasn't necessarily consumed by everyone. It was only consumed in small amounts, always in the context of a meal. There were no wine bars, there were no pubs, and often diluted with water, which might be a surprise to some. And a very low intake of red meat and eggs. When I say low intake, up to three to four a week, up to, not 3 to 4 or 7 or 8 per day, as we're seeing in modern diets today. And of course, ultra-processed foods, whether they were sugar or sugary foods or refined carbohydrate foods and fast foods, just weren't there. If you look at the ratio of animal foods to plant foods, and I've taken this from the study by Captain Theophilus in Melbourne, where they tried to simulate the traditional Cretan diet. Traditional Cretan diet, the ratio is 1 to 5. So 5 times as much plant food as animal food. In the current Aussie diet, and when they were doing this research study, it's more like 1 to 1. So, you know, a Cretan might have a whole tomato at a meal, an Aussie would have 1 slice in a sandwich. Cretan might eat close to half a kilo of vegetables a day. A typical Aussie might be lucky to get 2 serves, 2 half cups, and so on, and obviously much more olive oil. The other thing I'd quickly just mention, which is something that many people either don't know or don't realise, is that particularly, obviously, in Greece, where they practice, where they used to practice Greek orthodoxy and were quite religious, people used to fast. Now, what do I mean by fasting? There are many types of fasting, but in the Greek Orthodox faith, fasting means no animal products, no meat, no chicken, no dairy. And when you count up all their fasting days, which were, by the way, every Wednesday and every Friday of every week of the year, and also significant periods leading up to key religious holidays, when you count them up, guess what? They were more than half of the 365 days of the year. So what's this sounding like? It's sounding even more and more like a very high plant-based diet, isn't it? Half of the year they're virtually vegan. The other half they have a very low exposure to products, but they do have some. Now, there are many nutrients that have been discussed. The one thing we do know from research, it's not any one nutrient, it's not any one food, it seems to be the whole dietary pattern that's important, whether it's the higher omega-3 to omega-6 ratio, the high fibre content, the lower total protein with slightly more plant protein, and in particular, the exposure to far more phytonutrients than you would get in a Western diet. It is very much a plant-based dietary pattern. Lots of mechanisms are being studied. We won't go into them in great detail now. You've probably heard about most of these. Even something like, say, the glycemic load. When it comes to brain function at the moment, one thing we're realising is there are so many factors that play a role. But, for example, insulin resistance. Insulin resistance seems to be involved in at least facilitating dementia, which is why you may have heard some people call dementia type 3 diabetes. But when you have a diet that's quite high in fat, but with good fat, you actually lower the glycemic load, because that's what fat does to a meal. If you add nuts to a meal, you lower the glycemic load. Also, if you add something acidic like lemon or vinegar to a meal, you lower the glycemic load. And so the whole cuisine of how they season foods might be particularly important. There's lots of work going on in the microbiome, and even exposure to things like ages, which tend to be much lower if you have a plant-based diet using traditional cooking methods, and I'll come back to that just a little later. So let's get to the nitty-gritty of what you can do if you are interested in taking away some of these messages and implementing them in your own life. Number one, often in Australia and Western countries, vegetables are thought of as something on your plate. So you've got meat and 3 veg, but when the meat goes, something else comes on. But in the Mediterranean, vegetables were the main course. And this can be hard to understand until you try some of these dishes and you think, actually, I can eat just vegetables for a main course. But if you're just a plate of steamed vegetables, you probably won't feel like it is a main course. I'm going to show you pictures of the kind of meals I'm thinking about. So they would often have vegetables as the main course with bread, and that's the meal. Frequently raw salads to accompany most meals. And they would cook and prepare the salads and the vegetables with plenty of olive oil. And one of the things they found is that olive oil makes vegetables, particularly bitter vegetables, taste sweeter. It actually helps you eat more vegetables, which is one of the reasons they say that the Greeks eat more vegetables than most people, because they use so much olive oil. So here's an example. This is a vegetable dish. I've called it village vegetable stew. The word actually comes from Turkey, but they say it in Greece is purulu, which means a mixture of all kinds of vegetables. This is the main meal. And they would dip some bread inside and feel very, very happy. And there's quite a bit of olive oil in there, which makes it very sweet, and olive oil also thickens up the juices. So you could have a mixture, but even something simple as green beans. So the whole dish, the whole main meal is based on green beans, on one vegetable in this case. Now, the other thing that's interesting here is, see this red sauce? In Spain, they call this sofrito. You might call it salsa. This is another interesting component of the Mediterranean diet. Sofrito means a combination of extra virgin olive oil, onions or garlic, and tomato. And what they've shown in studies, this combination, which is used frequently as the basis for many, many dishes, stews and things that they make, is very high in antioxidants. So some people in Australia might use some tomato from a jar, but it won't have extra virgin olive oil. And they probably won't put a lot of onion and garlic inside. So this combination we think is really, really important. The other point I want to make is that how important dark green leafy vegetables are. They are crucial from a cardiovascular disease prevention and brain, cognition point of view. For a number of reasons. 2 that I'll highlight tonight is because of their high lutein content and their high nitrate content. Now, lutein, some of you may know, is what gives this colour, that bright green. And lutein is preferentially taken up by your eyes and goes at the back of the macula. It protects your eyes from macular degeneration. That's been shown. And the only other place that your body takes up lutein is in the brain. So the eyes and the brain really love lutein for some reason. It seems to be working as a very potent antioxidant. Now, in the Mediterranean, they would go and collect these greens, wild greens from the mountain, and cook them very simply in a small amount of water, which helps to reduce the bitterness. Many of these are very bitter greens. And then they would dress them simply with olive oil and lemon juice. And eaten that way, I tell you, you can eat a fair amount and get a lot of lutein on your plate. Wild greens, we now know, contain especially high levels of lutein. It's like beta-carotene.
Sorry, Sue, could you hold on for a minute? Can everyone please mute their computer?
We've got some visitors.
We've got some visitors in somebody's room there. Whoever it is, can you please mute your computer? Okay, thank you. Sorry, Sue.
No problem. So my strong recommendation to you is try and get these dark leafy greens into your everyday diet if you can. For the big MYB study that we're doing, we're going to be recommending daily intakes of these dark leafy greens. So this is not including broccoli or zucchini. They're also healthy. These are the leafy greens because they have exceptionally high levels of lutein. And the other thing they have exceptionally high levels is of nitrate. And you may know that nitrate is a precursor of nitric oxide. And nitric oxide, I mentioned earlier, is a potent vasodilator. It opens up those blood vessels, protects your endothelium from dysfunction. Herbs were used a lot, so using dried oregano on salads, to season vegetable stews. This is a very, very common practice. And when they did eat cheese, this is the interesting thing, cheese was usually used to season things, and not like a main course. It's used to season a salad or season a vegetable stew. Very different to how it's consumed today. My second recommendation for you is to start considering legumes as your meat from the soil. Okay. Now, this terminology or this phrase doesn't come from the Mediterranean. I first heard of this in South Korea, where they call the soya bean the meat from the soil. But I thought it just resonated so much with me because it made a lot of sense. It's how poor people used to get their protein from legumes rather than from cows or other animals. So try and get at least 3 meals per week where you're really emphasizing these legumes and replace meat for those. You can use canned or you can cook them from scratch. Cooking them from scratch makes them always taste so much better and tender. So in the Mediterranean, they would say use the onions and saute them in olive oil. But before serving, this is something I noticed when I first went to Greece that the older men still do. They pull out these lemons from their pockets and they squeeze lemon on top, lemon juice, and they pour raw olive oil on top. Now, by doing that, they're not only making it taste unbelievably delicious, but the raw olive oil has a much higher polyphenol content because the longer you heat olive oil, the more polyphenols you lose. There's a gradual decline in the content. You could make salads with legumes. Legumes really pack a punch when it comes to fibre. This particular recipe, a black-eyed bean salad with lots of oregano, spring onions, lemon, olive oil, 14 grams of fibre per serve. Some of you may know that the old recommendation in Australia that still exists is 30 grams per day, which in my opinion is far too low because the health effects really, if you want to make a dent in terms of health effects, you should be aiming more for 40 to 50 grams per day of total fibre. The other thing about legumes you may know is they are all across the board low in their glycemic index. In other words, they will raise blood glucose and insulin levels more gradually and they won't be peaking. Now, for those who are dedicated carnivores among you and cannot stand the thought of going totally plant-based, then go for fish and include that to replace some of that red meat. Whole grains, number 3. At the moment, for some reason, all carbs seem to be bad. Is that the impression you've been getting? Everyone's on a low-carb kick. But actually, this could turn out to be very, very harmful because carbohydrates, but the right type, the unrefined, are very important to feed your microbiome. And in the Mediterranean, they ate a lot of carbohydrates. Those Cretan men in the 1950s and 60s managed about 380 grams of bread per day. That's like half a loaf. But it wasn't that white, fluffy cotton wool bread. It was heavy, dense bread. In fact, sometimes they have a term called paximadia, which means double-baked bread that the shepherds would take with them on their long journeys. So any whole grains, preferably more intact, because the more intact they are, the slower they digest and release glucose into your blood and raise your insulin levels. So these are just some examples of some of the dishes I make with whole grains. This one here is based on frika, which is a green wheat that's picked green and lightly sort of smoked and then dried off. This is bulgur wheat with eggplant, so it's just cracked whole wheat. There are many things you can make. You can make salads. This is a barley salad. You can even make dessert. So this comes from the Mediterranean region, from the former Yugoslavia. When you go to Croatia or Serbia, they still make this. These are what they would say in the US, wheat berries. That means the whole wheat is cooked until tender and it's mixed through with a lot of nuts and seeds and some honey. And this is eaten for breakfast as a breakfast food or for dessert or a snack food. Many yummy ways you can use these whole grains. The other thing in the Mediterranean, which I think we could all learn to do, is they use fruit as dessert. They use fruit as a snack. Here, fruit is an afterthought, it would seem to be the case. Fruit intake by Cretan men was almost half a kilo. So that means 3 serves a day, not restricting fruit because it's too high in fructose or it's too high in sugars or too high in carbohydrates. A high fruit intake, if it's whole fruit, not juiced, seems to be very, very protective. In fact, many meals were based on fruit. So you would have grapes and bread, that is a meal. You would have watermelon and bread, that could be a lunch or that could be a dinner. They ate fairly frugally, as mentioned. Whoops. And even today, at the end of a meal, whether you're in Greece or in Italy, they automatically bring out some fruit. You don't even order it, you don't pay for it, because it's just the way that signals the end of the meal. And there is some research suggesting that this could actually be a really important habit, because fruit provides polyphenols. Some fruits provide large amounts of polyphenols. And as you may already know, after eating a meal, particularly not a healthy meal, with high glycemic carbohydrates and unhealthy fats, which can injure your endothelium, the polyphenols come along and may actually negate some of this injury. So eating fruit at the end of the meal may actually turn out to be very, very important mechanistically to try and prevent endothelial dysfunction. Nuts for a satisfying snack. I like to buy fresh walnuts, and if you're in Australia, you can get them now in big sacks of 10 kilos and get your partner, if you're too busy, to shell them, especially if they're watching TV. It's a really easy thing to do and quite addictive, because they are so delicious. They taste positively sweet. They're not rancid. They're not bitter like the store-bought ones that have been sitting on the shelf for many months and have already become oxidized. So after the Australian season, best thing is to buy your own. They're very easy to crack and you just freeze them, and that will then encourage increased consumption. Best to consume them with the skin on where you can. So, for example, on the walnut, that little brown skin is called a pellicle, and that is where most of your antioxidants are. Now, you might not think of peeling a walnut, but other nuts have their skin removed. Best to keep it on as much as possible. So nuts were used across the board, but when they did have cakes, interestingly enough, cakes with nuts featured very heavily. So there's an example of nuts which blunt the glycemic response being used with refined carbohydrates when they were consumed, whether it's white flour or sugar, and therefore dampening that surge in insulin. These are some nuts on ice, perfect for a hot day, something I had in Lebanon last year. Great way of serving them. And in general, most authorities recommend about 30 grams per day. This is a dessert, by the way, in a traditional Cretan restaurant that is Heritage Trust preserved, and the government's preserving on the island of Crete. And the dessert is just walnuts with honey. There you go. Try that sometime. Olive oil for cooking and for dressing. We are recommending in our Maintain Your Brain study 4 tablespoons per day, but it needs to be extra virgin. Don't buy anything else. Don't buy pure, don't buy light, don't buy pomace, don't buy anything. It has to say extra virgin, and even there are differences in the polyphenol content. But if you're using a spray of olive oil, you're not going to get any of the health benefits. In fact, most of the data suggests the health benefits start at 2 tablespoons a day, particularly for blood pressure lowering. But the Cretans actually used more than 4 tablespoons, closer to about 5 or 6 per person per day. Now, number 7, which is the final one, just a brief mention about these cooking methods. In the traditional Mediterranean diet, cooking methods were high moisture, lower temperature. So mostly stews, soups, or if they had it raw as salads. When you cook under these conditions, you don't form very much, if at all, of these compounds. Okay. Now, interestingly, ages can be formed in plant foods as well as animal foods. Animal foods naturally, even before cooking, for example, meat or chicken has a high ages content. But when you cook it, roast it, grill it, fry it, you form significantly more. So these figures are from some work from Catherine Itsiopoulos and her team in Melbourne, just to show you the same kind of thing cooked in different ways. Here's a chicken and broad bean casserole, which in terms of kilo units is considered to be a low ages meal. But you take that chicken and you take those potatoes and you fry them and you get almost 5 times the amount of ages. So just changing the cooking method makes a big difference. And here's one more example. Here's fish in the oven with vegetables. And incidentally, when they cook their potatoes, the Greeks, even today, they make what's called lemon potatoes. So they put a lot of lemon juice on the potatoes and put some water, and that creates steam. And those potatoes cooked in that way are much lower ages, if at all, compared to potatoes that are really crispy and crisped up like these. And this picture I took, of course, in the good old US of A. Very high ages meal. Okay, so just wrapping up, Mediterranean cuisine and lifestyle tips. Meals were mostly prepared at home. So I'm a big believer in getting back into the kitchen, teaching children how to cook from an early age, because the more we prepare the meals ourselves, the better they're going to be. The data bears that out. Meals were always eaten with family and friends, not alone. Snacking, which is very popular in Western culture, was very, very rare and very limited. In fact, often they'd only have 2 meals a day. And these were mostly farmers or shepherds, so they were on their feet, but yet they didn't snack incessantly all day long. Growing of vegetables seems to be important. You don't have to grow every single type of vegetable, but they've shown in some research, even in Melbourne, looking at some elderly Greeks that were born in Greece but are Australians now live in Australia, that those who have vegetable gardens of any sort tend to eat more vegetables simply by virtue of the fact that they're growing some of their own vegetables. Plus, they're more active, they're outside, get more vitamin D and all of that. Adequate sleep seems to be important. Napping, we've all heard of the siesta. So napping in the context of a physically active lifestyle seems to be very beneficial. There is some data and work in the Chinese population where napping in older people is associated actually with poorer health, but that's a different scenario. We're talking napping in the context, short nap in the context of an otherwise physically active lifestyle. Okay, so recommendations for use. Who is recommending a Mediterranean diet? You'd be surprised. Many authorities are now recommending this. Both the Australian and the US dietary guidelines. Okay, in fact, both recommend, apart from their mainstream dietary guidelines, a Mediterranean diet and a vegetarian diet. So that took some years, and some years in the making. Also, the Royal Australian College of GPs, did you know that? They have a website called Handy with all kinds of educational resources. It's free, you can go there. They recommend the Mediterranean diet for both primary and secondary cardiovascular disease because it's level 1 evidence, NHMRC level 1 evidence. American Heart Association, American Diabetes Association, because not only does it prevent diabetes, but it seems to improve glycemic control, and it also reduces cardiovascular risk factors. And once you have diabetes, you have up to a 4-fold risk of having some sort of cardiovascular event like a heart attack or a stroke. And even the Alzheimer's Society in the UK, even though the data is not conclusive in this area, already they're recommending this type of dietary pattern because, after all, there's really not much to lose and possibly a lot to gain. You might just, the side benefit might be that you might reduce your risk of other conditions. Now, I believe this book has been recommended to you as one of your references. So if you don't already have it, I know quite a few people have it. Some of those recipes, the images, they're all in the book. There's 150 recipes. But if you want to learn how to cook more Mediterranean dishes, I have quite a few recipes there. And these recipes I have researched in the culinary sense by visiting many villages and talking to aunties, they call them aunties, and grandmas, and actually actively looking at how they cook these things to try and work out the technique as well as you know, the ingredients. So in wrapping up, the Mediterranean diet reduces the risk of heart attack, stroke and diabetes. I think the evidence there is pretty much, especially for the first two, it's conclusive now. Diabetes is very likely. It's associated in many studies, observational studies, with slower cognitive decline. We've said that, reduced risk of MCI and dementia, but even conversion of MCI to Alzheimer's. This is a very promising area. More research is being done there. And it may also provide benefits for multiple other chronic diseases which are currently being studied. Key thing is the traditional Mediterranean diet, not what you'd get if you went to an Italian or a Greek restaurant in Sydney or in Melbourne or, San Francisco. The traditional diet was focused on unrefined plant foods, and it wasn't just a diet, it was a whole cuisine, and it was a whole lifestyle pattern. And on that note, those lifestyle elements, may I say, also may be key contributors to health benefits, and this is what's being looked at in the future. So thank you very much for being such a quiet audience. You can turn your microphones back on now, and I am more than happy now to take some questions and have some general discussion.
Thank you, Sue, very much. So the idea is whoever starts with a question, everyone else their computers will be muted until that question is asked. So leave it to the floor now. Any questions for Sue?
Can I jump in real quick? Hey, first of all, I just want to say, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, fantastic stuff. Thanks so much for sharing all that. Two quick questions. One is, I know, like, for example, when we look at tertiary prevention, like the work that Ornish did on, say, heart disease, where he actually showed regression of stenosis, he used pretty much a low-fat diet, and then you've got, Esselstyn, there's sort of these big names. Has any study been done using a Mediterranean-style diet that's actually showed reversal of that? So that's part A of the question, and sorry, I won't hog all the questions. But the other one is, I'm fascinated by, I saw a quote where they said that the 20th century was the century of cardiovascular disease, and this century is the century of neurodegenerative diseases. And like you say, I think it's what's interesting to me is that when it comes to things like your dementias and Alzheimer's, there are no other treatment options, which means that all of a sudden, if lifestyle intervention, intensive therapeutic lifestyle change shows promise, it becomes a whole lot more attractive. I think one of the things that's worked against lifestyle medicine in the cardiovascular space is that there are other treatment options that we've been able to develop. And so I'd love your thoughts on that. And coming to tertiary prevention again, are there any studies? I mean, I saw a pilot study that was done, a very small one by Dale Bredesen, I think it was, where he was almost like a portfolio style diet, where he just threw everything at this that they knew could possibly have an impact on the progression of Alzheimer's, and found that these people, some of them were returning back to work, which almost indicated that there was potential for not just slowing the progression of this, but possibly even reversing it. Is anyone going after that? I mean, the study you've referred to is sort of more secondary prevention. Is anyone going after tertiary prevention? Sorry, I asked too much just then, but I'd love you.
Let me see if I can recap. Ornish, yes, Ornish is an absolutely big name in the sense that he was the first person ever to publish in the days that nobody believed him, of course, and then he extended his research to 5 years and so on, showing reversal. There is some data from PrediMed that there are benefits in slowing progression of atherosclerosis, but I don't think, I haven't seen data that's potentially as strong as Ornish's data on that. Right. Having said that, Ornish's study was relatively small compared to PrediMed. There are many factors that come to play. Esselstyn, unfortunately, he might be a big name in popular books, but he really hasn't published anything in the scientific space. I've forever been, years ago, used to continuously search for data. so what he's got is case studies, and unfortunately in science it just doesn't cut it. Nobody believes anything unless you publish and it's been scrutinised by peer review. I think more work needs to be done in the reversal. That probably will come next. They're first trying to prove whether you can prevent. I think the reversal, studies will come. What we're seeing in the space of cognition and dementia is that because there are no treatments, they are now targeting risk factors and targeting lifestyle modalities, those two things. So you're absolutely right. I think this is going to be an incredible opportunity to intervene with lifestyle medicine. And I find that once somebody knows they're at higher risk for cognitive decline, they become very, very interested and very motivated to make change, perhaps more than in any other area. And in the MYB study, they actually are people from the general population. They may have some risk factors, they may not, but they are going to be using 4 modalities. One of them is physical activity, the other one's diet, one is, I think, mindfulness, cognitive training, the usual suspects, to see if in regular people of a middle age and older kind of stage of life, whether it still might slow the decline that is expected, the normal decline that's expected with age, gender appropriate, age appropriate sort of decline. So I think, we're still kind of at the prevention stage with a lot of this research. I haven't seen much done looking at reversal. I mean, it's taken a long time to even get health professionals to accept that a plant-based diet could prevent, let alone better manage, treat. So I think to talk about reversal, it's kind of scary for a lot of health professionals. Really? No, it can't possibly do that. Even the diehards, the believers in nutritional science. So, a long way to go. But
very, very interesting. Thank you.
Hi, Sue. I'm just wondering if you can just explain a bit about the ages that you were talking about before. I'm not quite sure what that is. I haven't come across that.
Good question. So ages, the word stands for three words. The acronym stands for Advanced Glycation End Products. Okay, so we make some inside our body. If you know anyone with diabetes, you might have heard of something called HbA1c, which is a measure of their average blood glucose control over 3 months. Guess what? That's an age. That's an ages. Years ago, ages from food or diet were not considered to be important because they didn't think you could absorb them or take in a lot. Now we understand that they are important. It's not just the endogenous ages, but the exogenous ages that you consume that may be important. Now, why? Because a diet or your body being exposed to lots of ages, particularly coming from the diet, what they found is high ages intake is associated with many health problems, such as particularly diabetes complications. In animal studies, they've shown if you can halve the ages content of their diet, of their animal feed, you can significantly delay complications of diabetes, especially renal disease. And this is really, really important because a key complication of poorly controlled diabetes is kidney disease. So if you halve the ages content, you improve or you prolong the time before they get complications. Ages also have been linked with accelerated aging, and maybe that's where the acronym came from, but with multiple different risk factors for diseases. So basically, and they've got some studies in humans, particularly diabetics with ages. If you lower the load of ages that they consume, their control seems to improve. So going back, it's not just the Mediterranean diet. Many traditional dietary patterns used low ages cooking methods because there was more steam, there was more boiling, whereas modern cooking methods, dry heat, high heat, are perfect conditions to create high ages, which we then eat. So all those lovely things like crisps and chips and biscuits and even processed breakfast cereals, guess what? Full of ages. because they are cooked in a way that's dry, high heat, using dry, high heat. I hope that gives you a little bit of background.
Yeah, it does. Thanks. It gives me something to look up too.
Yeah, there's actually a dietitian, Nicole Kello, who just recently finished her PhD in this very area of ages in Melbourne. I'm looking forward to reading her thesis because I've been interested in this area for a while.
Thank you.
Sue, I just wanted to know, I was under the impression that the olive oil or the better olive oil didn't really have much to do with the extra virgin part, but with the cold pressed part. Can you just explain the difference?
Okay, so the words cold pressed will probably, they're so common, everyone's going to use them for a while, but they're trying to get rid of those words because they don't really mean much anymore. Cold extracted is probably a better definition, meaning not extracted with any chemicals. And the reason for that is, for example, in Australia, when they make cold pressed, it's really cold extracted olive oil. They don't actually press it like they used to do in the ancient days. They used to press it, so that was the cold pressing. They crush it and they spin it in a centrifuge. So it's cold extracted but not actually technically pressed. When you do it that way, you don't lose the polyphenols, especially if you crush the olives very quickly after picking. So an extra virgin olive oil is usually an indicator of a high polyphenol content, usually. But it depends how old it is, okay? So a fresh extra virgin olive oil has a high level of polyphenols, and it also depends on which olive it comes from. Different olives have different levels of polyphenols. Some are actually extremely high, and different blends of olive oil from different types of olives have different levels. If you buy an extra virgin olive oil, and if it's fresh, if it's made in Australia, you will probably be getting around 400 milligrams per kilogram of polyphenol content. That's the average on the shelf. But you can buy olive oils 1,000. I was just in Greece last month, and I was indulging in extra virgin olive oil that had between 1,200 and 1,500 milligrams per kilogram of polyphenols. And I only know that because I know the person who presses the oil and he's had it analysed. This is from very particular types of olives. But all the research on olive oil and the Mediterranean diet and how olive oil fits in suggests unless you've got those intact polyphenols, the olive oil is probably not going to provide the benefit that, or the potential that it could, because the refined olive oil might even be harmful. It's just like refined vegetable oil. On its own, it does increase endothelial dysfunction, which is why I think we need to make sure we're only using the extra virgin with a high polyphenol content. Now, how do you tell? I think in the future they're probably going to label them. This is not happening yet. You could call the manufacturer. I've told you what the average is. I know that's the average in the Cobram Estate range because they have a whole lab and they measure all this stuff. And they have some with even higher levels, but they're not in the supermarket. You've got to buy them online and so on. So I think it's very important to get the high polyphenol, which is how it would have been a long time ago because there were no chemical extractions, no solvents. So look for extra virgin. Whether it's cold pressed or not, it doesn't matter because it's the extra virgin that really matters.
Sue, you mentioned the Cobram Estate oils. In the Evos, they've got different intensities. What do those different intensities mean?
Yes, from what I understand, having asked them about this myself, they've got different intensities, 3 little drops. One is 3, one is 2, one is 1. It's to do with the flavour. I think they're using different olives. One has a milder flavour, but they tell me they're all extra virgin. Now, I haven't seen actual analyses report to confirm that the one with the milder flavour doesn't have less polyphenols. And usually, the higher the polyphenol content of the oil, the more bitter, the more pungent it is. In fact, it gives you that, oh, this is quite peppery. That's usually an indication of a higher polyphenol olive oil. So I guess the only way to know would be to contact them and say, I'm using the 2-drop or the 3-drop or the 1-drop. Can you please tell me the milligrams of polyphenols? but usually taste is an indicator. Colour is never an indicator, which is why when you get the judging of olive oils, they put the olive oil in a blue glass. Because everyone seems to think, oh, the more green it is, the higher the polyphenol content. No, not necessarily so. Because if you throw in a few leaves when you're crushing your olives, guess what? It's going to bring a green tinge to your olive oil. And it may not be that high in polyphenols. And the other thing, the difference between Australian oils and overseas oils, you really need to know what you're getting from overseas. In Australia, they are required on the tin or the packet or the glass bottle to give you the date of processing or the date of production. Okay, some even give you a best before date. But the legislation is different in Europe, and all they're required to do is give you the date of packaging. See the difference? Date of processing is when it was made, the oil. Date of packaging, they're allowed to put, say, today's date, but they might have actually used a blend of a fresh extra virgin olive oil with an old one, which is quite low in polyphenols by now, because they've got leftover surplus from last year or so, and they need to dump it to another territory. So you want something as fresh as possible. So in Australia, you can see the date of processing, and the olive oil season is the same season as the nut season, which is roughly April, May, June. So shortly after that, you should be getting the fresh stock. And when it comes to polyphenols, they decline with time, like many nutrients. You know, within about 2 years, even under good storage conditions, you've probably lost about 40% of the polyphenols. So you want a fresh batch every year if you can get it. Store it well in a dark glass container. We have the bigger amounts in the tins, and we decant into a small glass bottle under the sink, and then we continuously top that up.
I've actually heard some people say that if you decant from a tin, decant into a number of bottles and freeze the bottles that you're not using.
I have never seen that practice anywhere in the Mediterranean. It's an interesting.
No.
I have had some patients who, in their effort to eliminate butter and margarine, they place a little bit of olive oil in a small butter-like container and put it in their fridge, and it semi-solidifies, so it's quite sort of spreadable. But you know, the Greeks just drizzle it on their bread, always with dried oregano, and that's kind of the bread that you have when you're eating your vegetables as a main course.
Thank you so much, Sue, for your presentation tonight. I just have a question about a clinical dietitian in a hospital, for example. I heard you say that we're making slow progress to health care professionals wanting to turn to a more plant-based diet. Do you think that there is a chance, even in the near future, that the hospitals, like clinical dietitians, would even want to implement this beautiful type of approach to nutrition for cancer patients? Because I see, like, a lot of things that I'm not a nutritionist, but I know that's not quite the best thing for them at this time. And another thing is consulting one-on-one the best place where you could actually implement and share this with your clients, this type of approach to nutrition? Because working in a hospital as a nurse, I see that it's a totally different approach. And I would just like to know, what do you think? How far off are we for our tertiary healthcare system to want to give it a go?
I would love to say it's round the corner. I would love to see a hospital that truly promotes wellness, maintenance of wellness. But really, hospitals are in the business of sickness. If people are too well, they're not going to come back as patients, are they? I don't know how long it's going to take a mainstream hospital like Concord Hospital or RPA or something like that to change their menu. All I can tell you is there is tremendous pressure on resources. And often for hospital meals, food service is given a measly little budget. You know, what can you make out of $1.50 or $2? And so the quality of the ingredients and the type of ingredients are just appalling. And really, the food doesn't do anything to help them get well or to teach them anything. And really, it's a teaching moment. It's an opportunity while they're there to not just tell them, but to show them. It's the same at schools, canteens, and so on. So I think it would take a real innovative CEO to see the value of this, to change the food service, to change the menu, to model proactively how to get better and to stay better, and to even, if I can go a step further, what I would like to see in hospitals is a whole, like a culinary suite, where each patient with a chronic disease is taken through an intensive, whatever it is, 1 week cooking course, okay, to learn hands-on how to use these unprocessed plant foods. It's one thing to tell them, another to give them recipes. It's quite another to show them.
And let them taste
it. You know, they can see it's not hard. Oh, and it tastes good. Oh, I never thought beans could taste good. You know, you overcome so many barriers at once. I think we're way off, but I would love to see a pioneering hospital jump on the bandwagon and do it. Until then, I think the one-on-one approach is very useful. I know a lot of dietitians would be very keen to bring in a healthier food service, but there are many different types of pressures, you know, in food services within hospitals, even if they are involved in that service, to change a lot. And then some people use the excuse, oh, but it's okay if they have eggs every day. They don't have them at home every day, and they want to have a choice. And, you know, meals are the one thing they look forward to all day. There's nothing else they can do. So, you know, it's a bit of banter that goes on as well. But I think we've got so much of a long way to go in that regard, and we should really be much more proactive.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Well, we've been going for over an hour and a half. I think unless there are any more questions, we might thank Sue very much and take note of one of her pieces of advice, and that is to get to bed early and have a good night's sleep, because that's very important for our cognition. Okay, no other questions?
Can I just ask a quick one?
Right.
What olive oil do you use then? Is it Australian?
It depends. I've just had a look. I've got about 6 tins there. We don't usually bring it back from Greece, but this year we have, because this particular type is so high in polyphenols. I wanted to bring it back, so I brought back 6 litres. Because I also have a Greek husband, he's very particular about the type of olive oil. So we usually use a Greek one. And I know also from speaking to one of Australia's eminent olive oil judges that the Greek olive oil generally has been a good one in terms of what they judge olive oils for. The one I would avoid probably, without offending anyone, is an Italian one, because apparently the amount of Italian olive oil that's sold far exceeds the amount that they actually make. And Choice, you know, the consumer group Choice, some time ago found that a lot of oils coming from Italy, being passed off as extra virgin olive oil from Italy, were actually oils made in Turkey with a little bit of extra virgin olive oil and refined vegetable oil, because anything with made in Italy sells. So I would probably get a local Australian olive oil with the highest polyphenol content I could. We tend to use the Greek one called Altis, A-L-T-I-S, because it has a very good flavour profile, and it used to have a high polyphenol content. But I've heard most recently in Greece, because it became so popular, they couldn't fulfill all the demand, so then they were buying in extra olive oil. So Altis is like the biggest brand in Greece. So I think the quality has declined, and that's also been confirmed by one of Australia's leading judges, who said he couldn't believe when they do the judging, it's all blinded. A few years back, the Greek olive oil used to win, but the quality has declined. So I think it's a matter, it's like fruit, it's according to the season, these things change. So you might have to, you know, mix it up a bit over time. But get one with a punchy, robust flavour. If it's got that, it's much more likely it is closer to nature than something that's highly refined.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Can I add a question here at the end here? I guess one of my questions from the start of this class on the diets, with looking at the Mediterranean diet, and I'm grateful you have more of a plant-based Mediterranean diet rather than you know, some of the Mediterranean diets proposed today have a lot more meat content. But one of my questions, it seems like a lot of the talk and a lot of the questions tonight revolve around olive oil. And obviously this is a bit of a difference, I suppose, between what's proposed here and what we've been educated with the CHIP program or something of that nature. So one of my question is, are the benefits that are in the olive, not just the oil? That's number one. So can we get lower fat intake? Because there's still a lot of, I'm looking online over here at my right screen, on Nutrition Facts, Pritikin, a lot of these guys that have traditionally talked about a low-fat diet still are promoting that even in the face of the research on, quotes, olive oil. So is there a way to get the protective measures of the olive without having the fat content? There's even research suggesting that these effects on the endothelial health is not so much dependent on the oil as it is on the high vegetable content of Mediterranean diet. And some of the PrediMed assertions have been challenged as well by some of these groups. So anyway, I'm just, research is always a fun thing to get into and to challenge premises and all that kind of thing. I'm just wondering if the olive contains that itself, and if the whole plant food diet, because that was kind of our main thrust, I guess, in our class, was the optimal diet. And do those whole plant foods still contain that benefit?
Good questions. The problem with eating the olive is it's inedible because it's really bitter. It's really bitter. So you have to make it edible by salting it. And so that's how we've preserved olives. And then if you start promoting a very high intake of olives that are highly salted, you're really significantly increasing sodium intake. But you could say someone might do that anyway because they love eating a lot of olives. I think the point of the actual olive oil is, and this is what they found in research, especially thinking of Professor Antonia Trikopoulou from the University of Athens, it's what binds the whole Mediterranean diet. It's what brings it together. It's, you know, they found that you eat far more of the vegetables when you cook them with the olive oil than when you have them, say, without, which they just don't do. And the other thing which has been pointed out even way back by Harvard researchers is when you add the fat, you absorb significantly higher amounts of all these phytonutrients, the antioxidants. So you could have your vegetable, you could have your tomato, have it raw, or have tomato juice, but when you cook it in olive oil, you absorb far more lycopene, and this is so important for health outcomes. I think the problem with many of these programs and courses is they were developed, if you look at their history, and I've spoken to some of them when I was over in the US, they were developed in the era when we all thought and all promoted low fat in general across the board. And it's very difficult for such a program suddenly to say, oh, well, actually we were wrong, or we need to change this. So what I've noticed, even with Dean Ornish, having visited him, they slowly, you know, oh, we'll add some nuts in now. Okay, nuts are okay now, but not in the first phase, or you can have a bit of avocado. So they're slowly shifting a little bit, nudging, but not completely. But you know, it's a personal opinion. They designed their programs a while ago. They're sticking to their programs. The programs obviously work, so there's no issue there. We just don't know, because no one's done the studies, which might be better, or they might be equally as effective. Having a plant-based diet with unrefined plant oils, as was consumed in ancient times, or a more modern unrefined plant-based diet that's low-fat based on our belief in the 1980s that all fats were bad. No one's done those studies head-to-head, and I'd like to see them. Yeah. So, yes, you will see proponents still promoting that, but I'm a big believer on where's the evidence. At the time, in the 80s, we didn't have evidence that some fats could be good, like nuts. I remember working in the hospitals, and we used to have nuts on the to avoid side if you're trying to lower somebody's cholesterol. So I think, you know, those kind of studies will need to be done to compare them head to head to see if one is in fact better or they're similar. The data's not there yet. So really what they're just promoting is a program they developed, but it hasn't been compared to more traditional dietary patterns that included some of these fats.
Can I just add, in terms of eating whole olives, I buy a big 2-kilo container of olives. And when I bring it home, I decant into smaller jars and put fresh water on them. And through osmosis, the salt is removed from the olive. When you taste those olives, they're significantly less salty than they are when they're processed. And even if you want to, you can remove that water and put fresh water on and virtually remove all salt from the olives. So that's how I get my olives, and I have, a dozen olives a day in my salad. So to me, there's ways around reducing the salt content of olives.
Is the olive the only place these polyphenols are found?
These unique ones, yes. But see, polyphenols, it's a huge family of multiple different classes. So hydroxytyrosol, tyrosol, there's oleocanthal, they are unique to the olive. And so there's some work also looking at their anti-inflammatory effects, finding they're starting to rival drugs like ibuprofen because they're COX-2 inhibitors. But, at the end of the day, what's important, I believe, is the total load of these anti-inflammatory antioxidants. So could you do it without olives? You probably could if you wanted to. Is it better to add them? We don't know. We just know it works this way. It works the other way. I can tell you just from my own experience, from trying to get somebody very mainstream in the public who's a dedicated carnivore to shift, it's a lot easier for me to get them to move slowly along the continuum than to take them from here to a low-fat, say 100% vegan diet. Even if I do a media interview, if I mention the word vegetarian or vegan, they just shut off. Oh, no, that's not for us. You mention the word Mediterranean. Oh, okay, sounds delicious. Okay, sounds like something I'd like. They don't really understand it, but it gives me an opportunity to get in and talk about things. And if I can just get little changes, if we get little
Sure.
changes across the population, I think we're making some inroads.
I guess I'm just, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, one more thing. It needs to be more research, but of course there is the olive leaf extract, and some people are taking some of this in small quantities, and that does contain the same things as the olive, and in higher quantities. But we just don't know whether, a teaspoon of that is the equivalent of 4 tablespoons of olive oil, and those studies haven't been done yet.
I guess I'm just mindful that I think the stat you said was a 45% calories from the fat from those olives oil. That just seems like an inordinate amount of fat in the diet. High calorie. There's still studies suggesting, and this was kind of a criticism in the PrediMed studies, is that the issues that really affected cardiovascular health wasn't the wine, the olive oil, and those things, but the vegetables and the nuts. So some of these counterbalancing studies to PrediMed, it's just, 45% diet in fat sounds like an awful lot. So maybe low fat, and going to what the low fat was when you said it was only 36%, that's not a low fat. Anyway, it's just a different way of thinking, I guess. And that seems to me an awful lot of fat. If people get the message that a 45% load of fat is healthy, and they don't go into the technicality that it's this particular kind of olive oil, etc., it can be, I guess the headline could view as high-fat diets are healthy. And so I guess, it's just how to package that and how to promote it. But I'm just not quite convinced that amount of fat is healthy, that's all. Yeah,
it sounds like a lot, but it's not a lot if you cook with it. How can I explain this? I used to, for many years as a practicing dietitian, before I read so many studies on this, I was also very careful not to add too much fat. Now I use it very liberally. It's been a process. The average was 42% fat, but I think what it is, it's a percentage of your total intake. So what that means is you're being, as a percentage, you're being exposed less to carbohydrates, and that's where it might be a good thing, because most of the carbohydrates people are consuming are refined.
Sure.
And I think I think that's where it's really helpful. The other point I just want to make, there's also been criticisms of the Pretty Men study that really it was just a study of olive oil and nuts.
No, yeah, it was more than that.
Because if you look at the actual amount that they consumed and where most changes in the dietary pattern were with how much olive oil and nuts they consumed. Not so much with vegetable intake going up that much, which is why it's been criticised for that. So was it really just a study of adding olive oil and nuts to your diet on a sort of a background Spanish Mediterranean diet? Yeah, who knows? It's very difficult to run RCTs with diet because it's hard to make people eat what you need them to eat. Either way, if it was just nuts, adding nuts to your diet or that, it still seemed to work. They're getting
and that was where Dr. Greger, I guess, poked holes a little bit in the PrettyMed, in that he said it was a randomized study. So even people that were on the olive oil, that doesn't mean they didn't eat nuts. They didn't control that group necessarily. It just means they ate olive oil. And it doesn't mean that the people that ate olive oil, that ate nuts, didn't use olive oil. And the controls, they had to go back to the research and factor out who actually ate nuts and didn't eat nuts. Because what the study was saying, supposedly, was that nuts didn't have an effect on mortality with cardiovascular disease. But when they actually went back and looked in the study as to who actually ate nuts and didn't eat nuts, it did have an effect. So I guess that's where the research, culling through the research carefully, and I don't think Dr. Greger is, I know he's very plant-based and vegan, but he doesn't have like a Pritikin history where he's having to keep an old system
he does
sustained.
Actually. His grandmother. It all started with Pritikin for him, but that's another story. What's important? It's one thing to recommend certain amounts. That's right. It's quite another as to what they actually achieve. So they looked at both, and what's useful, I guess, to look at is the table of actual average intake. So even in the Mediterranean diet with the added olive oil, they did measure other intakes of nuts and everything else. They did do that to see where the changes were in the different groups. And the ones that ate the most nuts were the group that they gave the nuts to for free, which is why they gave it to them for free, because they knew that would increase consumption.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I know it's getting late and we all want to go, but I have one last question, Lillian. I'm sorry. I really admire dietitians.
This is past my bedtime. 9 o'clock is my bedtime. So
this is a really quick yes and no question. Is it hard to become accredited dietitian? Is there much work available for people to practice in this area? Because I know it can be very competitive.
Is it hard to get into, or is it hard to get a job?
Job.
It depends. If you want to work in a traditional role, meaning in a hospital, in a clinical role, it is difficult to get a job for new grads. And there are now so many more universities than there were. We used to have 2 or 3 in the whole country. Now we have more than that, more than double that. But here's the good news, I think. If you are somebody who's a little bit more innovative, I think there are plenty of opportunities to work as a dietitian. You just need to apply yourself in different areas. You could work with corporations for corporate health. You could work in the media. You could work in, to improve the food service of a hospital unit. You could write, using the knowledge, nutrition science. There's so much more you can do, and I think it's a matter of inventing a job for yourself rather than expecting it just to be there. A lot of students that come through just expect, I'm going to get a job, and then they don't get a job, and then they go off and sell insurance or something. I think what a waste of 5 years that was. There are opportunities, but they're not the mainstream. I think you have to invent and create new roles and maybe combine them with other areas of lifestyle medicine. I think that's where the future is.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I think we will call it quits now. And just a reminder for my class, your assignments are due by 5 o'clock this Friday.
That's a nice parting greeting. Thanks so much, Sue. That was fantastic. And
Thank you,
thanks
everyone.
for jumping on board.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Sue.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for your questions, everybody. They were good questions.
Thanks so much, Sue. Learned a lot. Thank you.
Good
Thank you.
time.
Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask a question, Lillian? Sorry. With our one pager, what happens if we've got like a page of references?
I think I answered this question as a post. It's a one pager. The references are not part of the one pager.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Yeah, I did answer that question as a post.
Sue, I have
Thank
one
you.
last thing to say. You're pretty rad.
Oh.
Thank you.
Sue, what if we want to get you out to speak in an area? How do we contact you?
I'm taking bookings from March 2019.
That's what I
Andrew.
feared. Yes, 2019. I've got an evangelistic meeting at that time of year. Not November of this year.
I think the rest of this year it's just impossible. It's just crazy.
I get it. My conference president just asked if we could have somebody come speak to our pastors, and they were going to get a local physician. And then I thought, wait a minute, I'm talking to Sue tonight. Anyway, yeah.
I would love to, and I will actually be making myself much more available after March 2019. This is one of the reasons what I'm doing right now. But until then, I have to focus a bit more on my thesis.
Not a problem. Oh, of course, yes. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you, Lillian. Bye, everyone.
Good.
Bye.
Yes, Sue, thanks so much. That's brilliant.
Thank you. Bye, Darren.
Bye.
Let me go.